I'm Ammon. This is Being in Time, TikTok number 23. We're going to finish up the first introduction to Being in Time. Now, a friend of mine pointed out that I made a huge error in my last video in that I had a chance to mention a TikTok trend when I was talking about cleaning my office up here, and I failed to do so, namely that I ought to have mentioned that my office was very demure and very mindful. And even I am aware of this particular trend, so perhaps it's bad that I missed out on it. On the one hand, though, I think it's, I don't want to demean either you or me by pretending to be relevant. But on the other hand, there actually is a sense in which what we're going to be talking about today is a discussion of what exactly we mean when we talk not about demurity or demureness, but about mindfulness. In this video, I talked about this supposed crisis of relevance with respect not just to the humanities, although especially the humanities, but with respect to the academy broadly. And as I said there, and as I will continue to say, it will never cease to amaze me the extent to which we will let the most venal and narrow-minded of our interests and of folks convince us to abandon the relevance of the capacious capacity that we have for curiosity. And it's to say that to the extent that we're able to find things interesting and take delight in them, and discover more about them and ask questions about them, this is in and of itself an argument for their relevance. But rather than therefore seeing the vast number of things that we can discuss as signs of just how broad our souls or our minds are, instead of doing that, we allow ourselves to be convinced that if we can't constrain our inquiry to the most narrow and quote-unquote practical, again, practical defined by folks whose interests are not yours or mine, right, who are not actually concerned about your well-being or what happens to your heart, that we're somehow failing in what inquiry ought to be. I mentioned this in the context, as I said in the last video, of what Heidegger will call here the Ontico-ontological priority of Dasein. And in order to understand this, we're going to try to get in the next 5 or 6 minutes to a place where we can understand why Heidegger ends this section of the introduction with 2 quotes. The first of which is from Aristotle. So I'm going to try to come up here on this. So this says, as you'll see here, Aristotle says, "He psyche ta onta posestin," which is then glassed. Man's soul is, in a certain way, entities. The soul, it doesn't say man's soul, it just says the soul is, in some way, shape, or form, what is. He'll then further quote from Thomas Aquinas, so related to Aristotle here, talking about various what are called transcendence, and talking about the fact that truth is a transcendent. And he'll quote Thomas saying here, "This distinctive entity, that is to say the human soul, is the ens quod natum est convenire cum omniente," the being whose nature it is to convene with every other entity. This is, in fact, according to Thomas, what it means to think about the world as being, and this is very puzzling, this is very curious, true. So, remember in a previous video, we had also talked about this idea of everything, alles ist wahr und ein Warte nach Wahres. Everything is true and in some way awaiting the truth as a feature of what Dasein is. Well, in both cases, Heidegger is in some way here riffing on, this is something we'll talk about as we get further into the series, the phenomenological notion of intentionality, which does not mean what we usually mean intentionality to mean any more than when I say that there's some sort of notion of mindfulness here. It's anything like what we might mean, and I frankly don't know what the hell we mean when we're talking about things as being very mindful. Intentionality here refers rather to the notion that consciousness, that the soul, that the mind, that the heart, we can all use all these terms variously, is never sort of simply its own content, that it's always, to use a phrase that's often used, it's often blown out into the world, is how Jean-Paul Sartre will put it. That is to say that it's always, consciousness is always consciousness of something else. This is what it means in some sense to say that our soul is entities, right? This does not mean that entities are just sort of subjective ideas that we have, but it means that what we are is defined in how we engage with things. That what we are is where something, and this will be this extra add-in that Aquinas will mention, something like truth happens. Truth on this account will be a certain kind of event. Right? Things will come to be true insofar as they take place, insofar as our souls hit upon them in a certain way, which is of course very different than our souls hitting on things, which is something that will be for a later video, I'm sure. Okay, so what does it mean for our souls to hit upon things then? Well, this is where the ontico-ontological priority of Dasein will really step in. So recall 2 or 3 videos ago, I had started to sketch out some parallels that Heidegger had made. Parallels between, in the first instance, between what he talks about as the ontic and the ontological. I'm not going to belabor that one. But then in addition, he'll talk about the existentiel and the existential. And these will be spelled almost exactly the same. I'm trying to overpronounce the difference. One case, the existentiel, spelled with an E. The other, existential, is a word that you're probably more familiar with, spelled with an A. Now, this distinction is going to basically go something like this. We're going to use the term existentiel to refer to particular modalities of being, in this case of being Dasein, of having a there, particular ways in which humans are the kinds of things that they are. Any such way, we will say, is an existentiel possibility for Dasein. Modalities will fall into various broad categories, and in order to designate the categories, we use the term existential. So existentiel, a particular instantiation; existential, in some way, shape, or form, something that indicates the overall structure. The crucial thing, and this is going to be kind of hard to grasp for now, so I'm just going to sort of mention it and move on quickly, is that there's going to be priority here to the existentiel, to the specific and not to the general. That is to say, the only way in which there are general categories is as far as there are specifics, and insofar as those specifics are lumpable into groups that in some way like one another, or which fulfill parallel, analogous, or similar roles in the overall shape of let's say, the shape of a life. And this is important, is this is going to directly map on also to the ontico-ontological difference. Right? Remember, the ontical here names beings, right? When Aristotle says the soul is in a certain way beings, it's that ontic content. The soul is what it engages with. It's the encounter with all of the things that the soul encounters. It's that diversity of interest that we have, right? The very possibility of ontology only emerges insofar as we can ask the question of what those various contents could mean, and again, start to discover structure, similarities, etc. So the ontological will always emerge here out of the ontic. The way that Heidegger will describe that here is he'll say that Dasein is always pre-ontological. And this is what we mean by the ontico-ontological distinction. Now, pre here I don't love. The German here is ontologisch, right? When for does mean pre, it's the same suffix. But for can also sort of mean in an is sort of in and of itself already on its face a certain kind of thing, right? That is to say that already on its face, the various ways in which we interact with the world are already ontological. It is true that on the basis of those ways of interacting with the world, we can do something further. We can sort of engage in explicit, formal ontology. And our capacity to do that, our capacity to do science, our capacity to do philosophy, is something that Heidegger's explanation of what Dasein amounts to in being in time will have to take into account. But those possibilities are never going to be separable from the rest of what it means to be human, right? In fact, those possibilities are always in some way going to be simply explicating, making clear, or making transparent certain things that we're always in the process of doing. And it's that capacity which Heidegger is going to describe as the ontico-ontological priority of Dasein. Right? That as one of the ways in which Dasein behaves in the world, one of these existential possibilities, is a set of possibilities which will make the existential structure more clear. Some of the beings that we are concerned with are beings which are themselves indicative of, reflective of, or capable of giving me a particularly clear view of the structure of how I engage in inquiry at all. Some ontic forms of inquiry are particularly disposed to doing the work of ontology. So with that in mind, we're done with the first introduction, finally. We've got a sense here of what the project of being in time is. Because we want to reawaken the question of being, the question of what things mean, we're going to start off by looking at the kinds of beings that we are, insofar as we are beings whose souls are, in a certain sense, beings, right? We are the place where a conversation between ourselves and the world happens, such that we engage in things like ontology. Now, in the next introduction, we'll get into some of the methodological tools that we'll use to engage in that inquiry and to make that move and to make the kind of reflection that we're engaging in here particularly transparent.